right, hello everybody. Today we're going to go over notes from section 20.2 and 20.3. We'll review them again tomorrow when I'm back, but I think this should help hopefully go through some of it. And then also there's a video worksheet you need to fill out as you go. Goes along with the notes as well, so if you get lost or forget something, it is also on there. Tomorrow we're going to go over your Form 20.2. Your homework for tonight is Form 20.3. If you have extra time in class today, you can work on your Chapter 20 vocab word search. You can also work on your chapter review. Any of those are viable options. Or if you haven't finished your 20.2, you may want to get that done as well. Okay, so 20.2, we're going to talk about evolution and different types of evolution. So the first one is macroevolution. That's a grand transformation in anatomy, physiology, ecology, and behaviors, which usually takes place in clades larger than a single species. So what's talking about that is macroevolution is where we're really moving from mini microscopic bacteria all the way to a human. You see that very large change over time. Speciation is the evolution of a new species. And again, that's where we can get something brand new coming out of that macroevolution, where it evolved over time into a brand new species of organism that we didn't once have. We also have different types of extinctions that we need to talk about. So the first one is called background extinction. It's a slow and steady evolution and natural selection over time. Well, the main thing to know is, what is natural selection? Natural selection is the idea that the strong will survive to pass their traits on to the next generation, and there is a struggle for existence. So with background extinction, we're talking about natural selection picking what is the best trait to help pass on genetically for an organism to survive. So if you look down at the bottom, you'll see 3 pictures of giraffes. And you'll see there are 2 with shorter necks and 1 that's longer necked. That's why giraffes have such long necks, is because evolutionary traits have shown the longer neck to be more successful in their environment to be able to get resources, compared to the 2 shorter necked giraffes, which would go extinct because of not being able to get resources and survive. So this happened very slowly over time, and again by natural selection, that surviving and passing on of their traits. We also have something called mass extinction, where a large amount of species becomes extinct over a short period of time. After a mass extinction, biodiversity is dramatically reduced for a while. This occurrence offers new opportunity to other species that survived. So we believe during the dinosaur era, when dinosaurs ruled the earth and land, we had a mass extinction of dinosaurs because of a meteorite that hit Earth and killed them all off. And it was very quick, happened in a short amount of time. And that's also what allowed for mammals to take over. So that new opportunity was for mammals to grow larger because there was less competition with the dinosaurs now gone. The biodiversity at the time was quite small because of the dinosaurs being gone. You just basically took out a large chunk of a species that was around, and so when you take those out, that diversity, or the different types that are around, drop significantly. When we talk about evolution, we oftentimes talk about Charles Darwin. So we oftentimes call him the father of evolution. He was a naturalist that traveled around on the HMS Beagle, which was his ship, and he discovered ideas of evolution while landing in the Galapagos Islands. So when he went to the Galapagos Islands, he was writing in his journal, and he also had several other stops along the way. But he was able to look at the finches and other organisms to figure out what is evolution and what does it mean. So he came up with this term called gradualism. It's a term that describes the slow, gradual change of a species over time. So we know, if you look at this bottom picture, which is letter B of gradualism pattern, or gradual pattern, you'll see over time there is a slow change over time. It's not an instant like the punctuated pattern or the punctuated evolution, where it happens very quickly and occurred in a very small population like those Galapagos finches. So Darwin was looking at the finches and noticed that very quickly their beak shape changed based off what was readily available for them to eat. And so depending on what was available, they evolved very quickly to evolve a beak that would allow them to eat whatever was more readily available. So whether it was a seed with a hard shell so they could crack it open, they would have a certain type of beak. He viewed a lot less of this gradualism, that slow change over time. It was more punctuated. It was more of a quick change over time. So this picture down here, you could see punctuated, it quickly changed from a brown and white moth and a orange and brown over time to a mix very quickly. Wow, that gradualism, you see there's that gradual change over a very long period of time. There's two important patterns of macroevolution are adaptive radiation and convergent evolution. So adaptive radiation is defined as a rapid evolution of a small group of organisms that were radiated out in many directions, spreading over a large area. So an example would be the dinosaurs. So here's kind of a picture of what that would look like. So we start at the very left-hand corner where we have the stem amniotes. And then we could see it spread out over time to different organisms. And there's a gradual spread. So we could see there's the different dinosaurs within there. And as it kept going, it turns more and more into, since we're in the Cenozoic era, the era that we know today of organisms that are similar, but obviously evolutionarily different. But again, it's just that rapid evolution of a small group of organisms. So we could see that rapid change from a organism that looks similar to, let's say, a dolphin to what is known as today a dolphin. You can see there's a few of them, like the crocodile, that made it through all of those changes, and it has evolved, but it also has stayed relatively similar to what it once looked like back in the Paleozoic and Mesozoic era. Then we also had something called convergent evolution going on. That's when organisms in different parts of the world develop similarly due to similar environments. So there's an example down here. We have an emu, an ostrich, and a ray are similar looking birds, but they evolve on different continents. So the ostrich on the far left side, and again, you can notice similarities between the three of them. You can tell they have long legs. They have kind of a egg-shaped body. They have feathers that cover them. And they also have a small head with a big beak on the front of their face. And they also look like they kind of have a tail. But you can also notice very large differences between them of, an ostrich has a really long neck. Emus have hair that covers a lot of its neck and seems to be a little bit shorter. The ray, even shorter, but they look very similar. The ostrich is found mainly in Africa. The emu is found mostly in Australia. And then the ray is found in South America. Again, all different parts of the world, but again, they have a bird or a flightless bird that all look and behave very similar to each other because their environments are close, but not the same. Even over here on the right side, you can see there are some organisms that are found in North America compared to what is found, or North America, South America, compared to where it's found in Australia. So for example, we have like the mouse or the marsupial mouse. Again, look very similar, but there are slight differences between them. We have the wolf and the Tanzanian wolf. Again, look very similar. Again, there are differences because again, they do live in different environments a little bit. But they still have those evolutionary traits to them that make them look similar, and due to their similar environments, evolve to look the same. We also have something called coevolution. That's when two organisms evolve their coexistence by developing traits that help each other out. So these two organisms tend to work together to be able to evolve to help each other. So if we have a lot of times, it'll be like plants and their pollinators. So for example, if we see the bird on the left with the flower, you can see its beak has evolved to be able to get down to the nectar down at the bottom of the flower. But you can also see that the pollen is found at the very top of the flower. And so since the beak goes into the flower, that pollen will then easily be transferred to the bird, and then its pollen will be moved a lot easier. So they evolved together to be able to help each other out. The bird can get to the nectar and pass its pollen, and then the flower is going to keep that shape as well and have an easier way to pass on pollen. We can also look over here when we're talking about specific organisms, so like these flies. They'll see that they will eventually evolve to have longer and longer kind of, don't really know what to call them, like a pollen, like a beak sort of thing, will allow for the pollen to be moved from one plant to another a lot easier, and it'll often either shorten up to make it easier, or the kind of nose here will lengthen to be able to allow for easier access to the nectar in the plant, and also movement of pollen as well. So again, they just are working together. Again, that prefix co means together, evolution to evolve and change. So coevolution, evolving together to help each other out. Okay, so that's 20.3. So we talked about mass extinction. So that's the basically getting rid of a large chunk of organisms in a very quick motion. There's also background evolution, where it's very slow over time, but a slow extinction. There's also talking about Charles Darwin, the father of evolution, and he's talking about natural selection. So nature kind of deciding what is the best trait to be passed on to the next organism or to the next evolutionary trait for the best chance of survival. And then we talked about coevolution as well. Section 20.3 is the mystery of life. So how did life come to be? How did those microscopic bacteria actually come to life? Since at the beginning of Earth, there was considered to be no life. It was hot and poisonous to what we consider to be life today. How do we believe at one point life began? So geological and astronomical evidence suggests that the Earth was formed as pieces of cosmic debris collided with one another. The entire globe melted together and experienced millions of years of volcanic activity. So what they believe is at the beginning of Earth's creation, there was kind of meteors and meteorites crashing into each other, having a lot of energy and causing this large melting of the globe. It then went through this volcanic activity. Again, that core is melted, lots and lots of pressure is being built, and so it was kind of inhabitable for a very long time. So about 4.2 billion years ago, the Earth cooled enough to allow solid rock to form and water condense to fall as rain. So again, 4.2 billion years, it wasn't able to cool. So it finally cooled enough to create a crust and then water to condense and fall as rain. So the atmosphere at the time was little or oxygen free. It was made up of carbon dioxide, so CO2, water vapor, nitrogen, carbon monoxide, hydrogen sulfide, and hydrogen cyanide. So those are very poisonous gases and not ideal for life. The atmosphere was a pinkish orangish color. It was poisonous, and the water had so much iron in it that it was brown. So imagine looking out your window right now and you see a pinky orangish atmosphere. Instead of the blue skies that we're used to, it's pinky orange because of the different compounds and elements that are in our atmosphere at that time would reflect this pinky orange color. And then the water had so much iron on it, it was brown instead of that blue color that we're used to. So it'd be very, very different from what we know it today. So we had two American scientists named Stanley Miller and Harold Urey tested the Operins hypothesis in 1950s. They designed an experiment with a glass apparatus that was to simulate the Earth's early atmosphere. They added water vapor, methane, ammonia, and hydrogen. The electrodes were used to stimulate lightning, and this experiment produced organic molecules like amino acids and the building blocks of proteins. So you can see down here, this is the apparatus that they had in the left-hand corner. They had an electrode going in to produce lightning because they believed at the time there was a lot of storms and lightning going around because there's so much energy. We had water condensing as water vapor, and then they had that ammonia and methane and hydrogen, and they believed those were the vapors making up the early atmosphere. Now, obviously, do we know that for sure? No, we don't have anybody there to say, yes, this is 100% accurate. This is just what they believed at the time and what we've seen on other planets. And so they released a spark, and when they did that, they noticed in the liquid water that they were finding those organic molecules like amino acids that were able to build proteins. And we know proteins are part of the building blocks of life. And so they believed that was how life was initially created. And again, do we know this for sure? No. But it's a really solid idea as to how the first life came to be. There is a really good video. My iPad won't let me play it right now, but it is in my slides as well that I highly recommend checking out if you're still curious about the Miller-Urey experiment. These large organic molecules form tiny bubbles called protonoids, and they're protonoid microspheres. They're not actually cells, but they have many characteristics of living things. So they would follow a lot of what Leacture was. So energy and responding, and they aren't technically cells. They're just like kind of a bubble looking thing. But they're still making of proteins and go through homeostasis and growth. So they followed a lot of Leacture, but they weren't exactly what we consider today's cell. The evolution of DNA and RNA, organic molecules became RNA, which can change to become DNA. So the belief RNA existed first and then became DNA. So RNA, this picture down in the left-hand corner, RNA is just a single line of information. It's basically telling you about the DNA without being DNA. We call it messenger RNA most of the time. And it kind of tells you how to make proteins. So a lot of times we can use RNA and make it into DNA. So they believe RNA came first, and then it made it into DNA later on to make that double helix shape. The oxygen develops in the atmosphere. So oxygen developed in the atmosphere about 2.2 billion years ago. Photosynthetic bacteria began to produce oxygen in the form of iron oxide. As more oxygen began to accumulate, the ozone began to form. The rise in oxygen actually provided some early life to extinction, but opened the door to evolution of new species. So again, if you think about it, the very beginning of the Earth, that atmosphere had very little oxygen actually in it, and those organisms survived without oxygen. So once there was more oxygen around, it led to that early life's extinction, but it allowed for other organisms to evolve and be able to use oxygen and become aerobic, unlike the anaerobic organisms before them. So, and also that creation of the ozone really helped protect a lot of organisms from harsh UV rays and things like that. That allowed for more evolution to occur of those new species. We have a theory called endosymbiotic theory. This states that the prokaryotic cell joined together and developed into a eukaryotic cell over time. They changed an anaerobic cell to an aerobic cell. It's further hypothesized that some of the prokaryotic cells became the mitochondria to make energy for the new eukaryotic cell. So this was all founded by Lynn Margulis. She was the main support system behind the endosymbiotic theory. So they believe at the very beginning that it was a prokaryote. Again, no nuclei, no membrane-bound organelles. Over through evolution, they then switched from a prokaryote to a eukaryote. So they believe that the mitochondria was actually a prokaryote that was kind of absorbed into this new eukaryote to be able to produce energy. Because we know, most of us, that the mitochondria is known as the powerhouse of the cell. It's what creates energy for the cell to then be used. And so that kind of switching from a prokaryote to a eukaryote and taking in old prokaryotes and absorbing them into this new cell to create a nucleus and create the mitochondria in cyanobacterium really helped evolve a eukaryotic cell. So that's why we called it the endosymbiotic theory. And we also went from anaerobic, meaning not using oxygen, to aerobic cells, needing oxygen to be able to survive. The evolutionary change from asexual reproduction to sexual reproduction. So this is important because sexual reproduction provides for more variation in new cells. And this causes a unicellular cell to become multicellular organisms. So sexual reproduction versus asexual reproduction. Asexual is where there is one parent and it splits into two identical daughter cells. So there's really no variation. It's literally one cell splitting into two. While when there's sexual reproduction, two cells combine to form one brand new cell. And that forming of a new cell allows for a lot more variation because we're taking in more DNA and finding out what is going to be expressed and what is not going to be expressed. So that really helped cause unicellular organisms or cells to be able to go into multicellular organisms and allow for that changing of and that evolving of more unicellular to more multicellular. And we also talked about often at the beginning, we had this idea of spontaneous generation. So the idea of spontaneous generation says that the living comes from the non-living. So an example, frogs seen coming out of the mud, so people thought they came from mud. So they believed that things just kind of poofed out of no thin air and just showed up. And, a frog came out of the mud, so that means frogs come from mud. And we're like, okay, that makes sense, because we didn't know at the time. So this idea was accepted because there was no other explanation. We really had no other way to explain how things came to be. But in 1668, Francesco Reid, an Italian physician, developed this theory by using an open jar and a covered jar of meat. So he noticed that if we had a jar that was covered with meat and then a piece of meat that was just sitting out, the flies laid their eggs called maggots, and then those developed to form flies, but not on the meat that was inside of the jar. Well, that kind of defeats the purpose of spontaneous generation. That in theory, if I had a piece of meat in a jar and a piece of meat on a counter and we stuck to that spontaneous generation idea, both of them would produce maggots because that's just how it worked. They just automatically, flies were born. Well, it soon found out those maggots came from flies that would land on the meat to then lay their eggs and then for them to hatch and form into maggots. While the one inside the jar, the flies couldn't get to, so they couldn't lay their eggs. So it really deterred the idea of spontaneous generation. Louis Pasteur in the mid-1800s developed this idea of spontaneous generation. He did an experiment that did not allow air to be used and no microorganisms appeared. So they gave rise to the theory of biogenesis, an idea that all living things come from other living things, which makes total sense. Living things need to give life to other living things. They don't just pop out of nowhere. Louis Pasteur also came up with the idea of pasteurizing, so killing of bacteria that live in things like milk. So that's why we pasteurize all of our cheese and milk, just to get rid of the bad bacteria living in it, because we know life comes from life. Living things, this came from a living thing, and so there's bacteria in it that is not necessarily good for us to ingest, and so we pasteurize it to then get rid of it because those no microorganisms appeared. Biogenesis, if biogenesis is true, all living things come from other living things. Then the question is, how or where did the first cell or organism come from, and would have to be answered from the first organism or cell. So again, we can't prove this to be true because we can't go ask the very first cell or organism, hey, how were you born, or how did you get here? We can't exactly say yes for sure, but we can absolutely hypothesize the beginning of life. So Alexander Ophren and John Heidelin hypothesized that life began in the ocean. So they suggested that the energy from the sun and lightning triggered a chemical reaction to produce living molecules. Those molecules then clumped together to be able to make proteins, and then it just built from there. So we believe, as of now, that life came from the oceans of early Earth, and that lightning kind of started this whole idea of, or the lightning triggered this chemical reaction to occur to produce the molecules needed for life. And those molecules stuck together to be able to form microscopic life, and then it evolved over time. And again, we cannot say for sure 100% this is exactly how it happened, because we can't go back in time and go back 4.6 billion years ago. But we can hypothesize that this is what happened. So we can get rid of the spontaneous generation idea and stick to more of a biogenesis, that life came from early life and that there was the ingredients there to make life, the lightning triggered that chemical reaction and then produced those living molecules. Okay, so that's all I have for notes today. Your homework tonight is Form 20.3. Tomorrow when I get back, we'll go over Form 20.2 and 20.3, and then we'll also review over notes quickly to get you ready for your quiz on Wednesday. Please feel free to email me. I will try and get back to you as soon as I can. And have a great rest of your day.